Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for an MP webinar covering 2023 HR Year in Review and a glance into 2024. I'm Brianna Hostler, Marketing Specialist here at MP. For those of you joining us on a webinar for the first time, MP is a full-service human capital management company. We offer a complete suite of products and services to support organizations through the entire employee lifecycle, including recruiting, HR, payroll, benefits administration, time and attendance, and compliance assistance. We support our clients with cutting edge technical solutions as well as proactive, reliable service and deep HR and payroll expertise. At MP, we are wired for HR and help our clients succeed by aligning their people strategy with their business goals. I'm excited to introduce your presenter for today's program, Paul Carelis. Paul has over a decade of experience in the HR consulting space, working with businesses of all sizes and industries. Paul leads a team of SHRM certified HR professionals at MP. Together, they assist clients with compliance, training, and HR guidance and support for the full employee lifecycle. Paul also spearheads MP's Employee Retention Tax Credit Services. This initiative has helped thousands of clients claim over $100 million in refundable, advanceable tax credits. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started here today. If you'd like to submit a question during the program, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We'll be sending out the recording of the webinar later today along with the slides. And with that, I'm going to hand the mic off to Paul.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Brianna. Good afternoon, everybody. Looking forward to today's session. It's been really fun kind of looking back on what 2023 was in terms of HR and employment law. It's been a busy year, a lot of activity, a lot of significant rulings, and a lot of significant movement, some of which we won't really feel the impact for until next year, but we'll certainly talk about that. So what we hope to cover in today's session is a brief kind of legislative overview in terms of what laws were passed at the federal and state level in the last year that impact employers. Then we'll talk about, a few of the top HR trends and really what was captivating HR professionals in 2023. We'll also talk about, outside of actual formal lawmaking, significant activity that occurred this year at the federal agencies, both the National Labor Relations Board as well as the Department of Labor. Those potentially have even more impact, along with the Supreme Court, than what's happening in the legislature and the state and the House of Representatives. Some really significant cases and rulings and rulemaking going on there that could really flip some things on its head in the next year. Again, we'll touch upon some state laws, both things that have been enacted as well as what we're seeing from trends. Oftentimes what a couple of states do will quickly snowball and start to spread across the country. So important to look at that always. And then, as we like to do, we'll gaze into our crystal ball and kind of predict what we'll be talking about this time next year in terms of things that were impactful and what our focus points are going to be in the 12 months to come. As always, feel free, as Brianna said, to utilize the Q&A functionality within the Zoom here. I'll be happy to get to any questions that we can before the end of today's session. So let's dig right in. So in terms of some trends across the legislative landscape in 2023, first one is minimum wage. So almost half the states in the US increased their minimum wage to some extent in 2023. That being said, as of right now, only 3 states and the District of Columbia are at that kind of $15 per hour number that you hear so often, and has really become a rallying cry of the pro-labor movement. There are, again, only 3 states currently at that threshold, but minimum wages are on the rise in several states. That being said, there are still 20 states that are remaining with the federal minimum wage, which has remained at $7.25 since, I believe, 2009. Not sure if we'll see that bump at all in the year to come, but as of right now, that is still $7.25, and there are 20 states still observing that. Sometimes, in terms of how often that is actually utilized, will depend on where in the state a business is. Certainly, if you're on a border with a state with a higher minimum wage, it'll be tough to attract talent paying the federal minimum, but it is still in place in nearly half the country. Another big trend in terms of legislation has been pay equity and pay transparency. So at this stage in the game, as of the end of 2023, more than half of all states have some sort of pay equity or pay transparency law. Those range from state to state. Some of them are as simple as restricting what questions can be asked in the interview process, especially when it comes to salary history, what someone has made historically in their previous roles. Others have true pay equity laws in place where there are requirements for people working similar roles and duties to be paid equitably and not be discriminated against based on gender. Some states have other protected classes included in their pay equity laws as well. And I'd say the most trendy of the pay equity and the pay transparency laws that we're seeing pop up from state to state are indeed pay transparency, where businesses are required to state pay ranges on job postings, and in some cases internally as well for existing positions. That's what we're seeing a lot of new legislation being passed on is that transparency piece where those figures do need to be disclosed up front. Also seeing some trends where more and more job seekers are really expecting that, whether it's something that's required or not. There are studies that are showing that a growing number of potential candidates won't apply for a job unless that pay range is disclosed up front. One thing to be mindful of, and even more so than minimum wage and other laws that we see pop up at the state level, there are several cities, counties, municipalities that have their own pay transparency laws. So if you're hiring in remote locations or expanding your reach into jurisdictions you haven't been in before, just take a look and make sure that there isn't a pay transparency requirement. I have seen businesses get called out when they posted a job, in a state or in a locale that has certain posting requirements, that there are representatives for those state agencies and city agencies taking a look at job postings and calling out folks who aren't in compliance. So just make sure you're on the up and up there. Also, again, if you are hiring remote positions, and the laws on this vary state by state, but do make sure you're in compliance. If you're open to hiring someone in a state or a city with a pay transparency law, just make sure your postings are meeting their respective requirements. Also seeing action both at the federal and state level when it comes to non-compete agreements. So at the federal level, it's more within agencies. The FTC is trying to enforce a ban on non-compete agreements. The National Labor Relations Board, who we'll be talking about momentarily, has also weighed in on non-competes, finding them something that's outdated and should be done away with. But in addition, we're also seeing several states pass either restrictions or outright bans on non-compete agreements. They're definitely becoming a thing of the past in many places, especially with so much entrepreneurial spirit here in the U.S. We're really seeing more and more states pressure businesses from moving away from those. So if it's part of your current onboarding process, again, just double check. Some states are still allowing them for certain positions and salary amounts and with certain restrictions in terms of time and value and geography. Again, others are banning them outright. So just make sure if you do utilize them that you're still allowed to do so. Also, a lot regarding pregnancy accommodation. So the federal law was passed in 2023 that requires accommodation by employers for pregnant workers. Really waiting on the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They're tasked with weighing in on the guidance and really the rules and the best practices for being in compliance with this. They issued their proposed rules. The final rule is not yet out, but it could be significant. Some of the language in the EEOC proposed guidance was much different than what we've seen at the state level. So really requiring employers to accommodate pregnant workers, even if those accommodations would be outside of the ability of the employee to perform the essential duties of their job. So keep your eyes peeled for that. We'll certainly be sending further guidance as it becomes final. And I'm sure doing some presentations like this on that topic as well, once there's the final set of ground rules for complying with the pregnancy accommodation bill. Also, 2023 saw an increase in the number of states adopting paid family leave programs. So that currently stands at 14 states and growing. Typically, when these things pass, they don't take effect right away. There'll be a set time when either the tax or the contributions or the setup of the plans and the funding of the plans will start. And then months or sometimes a year later is when employees will actually be able to take advantage of the paid family leave programs. What we're seeing as more and more states are now having several years of experience with these is that typically the first year or two, participation and activity within these paid family leave programs is not quite what people expected or perhaps feared, depending on what your circumstance is. But as time goes on, and people become more aware of these programs, the rights that they're availed to, and their ability to take advantage of them. At least anecdotally, we're seeing more and more employees taking advantage of PFL and PFML in their respective states. And I think you're also seeing that reflected as many states are increasing the contributions to keep those plans solvent. That also indicates that more and more employees are taking advantage of these. The tricky thing for employers is that with all these other items as well, the rules and the specifics of each program vary widely from state to state. You can go from Massachusetts, which has a plan that provides quite a bit of leave and a healthy percentage of pay awarded to the employees versus, you go a few miles north up to New Hampshire and it's a completely voluntary program that employers are not required to participate in. So the rules can vary greatly from state to state. So if you are or do have employees in those 14 states that currently have the programs, again, make sure you're working with an HR professional who can help you strategize and A, make sure you're compliant, and B, make sure that you're setting yourself up for success with these paid family leave programs. All right. So, in terms of federal agencies, let's start with the Supreme Court. There were several groundbreaking decisions by the Supreme Court, and a handful of those did affect employment law. Um, you can definitely check some of our previous webinars on demand for some more details about those. There's just one that I wanted to bring up again because it is significant. We're seeing ramifications following that in employment litigation. So religious accommodation, that case was Gruff versus DeJoy. It was decided over this past summer. And for those of you who weren't on any of the previous webinars, just a quick summary. This had to do with a postal carrier who was a practicing Christian, kind of took the job with the understanding that they wouldn't have to do deliveries on Sundays because that typically hadn't been part of how the postal service operated. But as they evolved and started doing more work with e-commerce and folks like Amazon, they did start adopting Sunday deliveries. This employee requested to not work on Sundays so that they could practice their religious beliefs. And at first, the Postal Service granted that accommodation, but over time, as their staffing was cut and there was a big uptick in their need to deliver on Sundays, they eventually denied that accommodation request, which then led to this lawsuit. And at the end of the day, the Supreme Court sided with the employee and said that the bar for a business to reject a closely held religious belief and corresponding religious accommodation request is very high. You really have to be able to prove that it's going to be detrimental to the business to not grant that religious accommodation request. So again, if you're encountering religious accommodation requests, definitely speak to a labor attorney and or an HR professional about the details of the case, and just know that more often than not, the advice that you're going to receive will be to grant that request. Looking ahead to the new Supreme Court term, which just started this past October, there were a few cases that could potentially impact employment law and employment and HR best practices in the coming year. So there's a case regarding the Americans with Disabilities Act and how far-reaching that should be in certain instances. There's also going to be a couple cases on social media and First Amendment rights, which obviously could bleed into employee rights as well. And then also a case on Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and potential discrimination, and particularly if discrimination occurs in the case of certain job transfers, if transferring from one position to another can be potentially viewed as discriminatory under Title VII. So keep your eyes peeled for that. We'll certainly have that as part of our legislative update in the months to come as the court hears those cases. Okay, so agencies have been super busy in 2023. It took them a little bit of time to get the people in the seats and the nominees confirmed and all of that, but once 2023 started, they hit the ground running and they haven't looked back. The National Labor Relations Board, which oversees the National Labor Relations Act and employees' rights under that, largely having to do with an employee's right to collectively bargain and unionize, but also definitely impacts non-union workforces as well. They've been very busy. So at the end of 2022, they did receive a $25 million increase in their budget. They were very, very short-staffed prior to that, so they still consider themselves to be short-staffed, but there was definitely an injection, and they were able to backfill some roles and increase the headcount some. So they're definitely playing with more folks and more money than they were last year. One of the most significant developments over at the National Labor Relations Board was the final version of the joint employer rule. So this is set to take effect December 26th. So in just a couple weeks, the day after Christmas. And this is going to really affect businesses and when a company may be considered a joint employer. So some examples, if you're not familiar with that term, would of potential joint employer scenarios is when there's some sort of shared responsibility and liability between two parties and an employee. So the cases that tend to come up over this would be a franchisee franchisor situation. So for instance, how responsible and liable is the McDonald's Corporation for the actions that their franchisees take and the labor laws and the rights of their employees to collectively bargain at the franchisee level. Can also come up in things like staffing agencies. So a staffing agency who sends an employee to a work site, that's tends to be a more obvious joint employer situation where there's some shared responsibility there to make sure labor laws are being observed and followed and the employee is being treated fairly. Up until now, there had been a joint employer rule, I think dating back to 2021, that really said that in order for a joint employment situation to exist, that you had to take a look, and for a party to be considered a joint employer, they had to have substantial direct and immediate control over the worker. So that limited the amount of joint employer scenarios that we saw under the National Labor Relations Board during the last couple of years. This new rule, once it takes effect, is going to greatly loosen that and say that both direct as well as indirect control over matters of importance can be considered a joint employer scenario. So even if it's indirect, if that kind of larger governing body has some say in terms of pay, workplace policies, how the work is done, when the work is done, those types of things could potentially lead to a joint employer scenario. So there'll be more guidance on that coming as that due date comes close. But if you are potentially a joint employer, you're going to want to speak with someone and review how that may impact your business. So in terms of National Labor Relations Board by the numbers, in fiscal year 2023, which they just released some data on, they did have 22,448 cases filed. So those are complaints from workers to the National Labor Relations Board that their employer was practicing some sort of unfair labor practice or illegally blocking their right to collectively bargain or something like that. So that number represents a 10% increase in the number of cases filed versus fiscal year 2022. And it's also the highest number in almost 10 years over at that agency. They also saw the highest number of union petitions filed since 2015. That number was 2,594 union petitions. It's a 10% increase over 2022. And 2022 was a big increase over 2021. So that number is continuing to trend up. definitely seeing a lot more in terms of both union elections as well as labor stoppages and strikes. As I'm sure you saw in the news, there were several year highs in terms of the number of people on strike over the summer between the auto workers and the actors and the writers and several smaller organizations as well. Continuing with the NLRB, um, they, at the very end of 2022 and went into effect in 2023, they do now have a new standard for recognizing and bargaining. If a union or a group can demonstrate that they have majority support to potentially unionize, it is now the responsibility for that employer to bargain and work with that group to potentially unionize. There's also a wider net cast of unfair labor practices that the National Labor Relations Board will hear, and they've also been exercising their right to quote unquote make employees whole. So they're limited in their ability to attach additional monetary fines in many cases to employers, but they do have the power to demand making an employee whole, and we're seeing that happen more and more. We also saw in 2023, the National Labor Relations Board really tightened the definition of independent contractor. So this had to do with a case that we talked about in a previous webinar, but it had to do with makeup artists at the Atlanta Opera House and whether they were independent contractors or employees. And in their case, the NLRB decided that they were employees because the control of their work when it was done and what shows it was done for uh, was controlled by the Opera House. So really where the NLRB weighs in on this is they want to count more people as employees, or at least make sure that they're properly classified in case they should want to be part of the labor union if it's in place at that place of business, or give them the right to consider collectively bargaining. There were also several cases heard by the National Labor Relations Board in the past year over workplace rules, handbook policies. Stericycle was really the landmark case there that really shed some light on the current iteration of the board and what they view as unfair labor practices and or policies that could be chilling to employees' rights. So if in the back half of 2023 you hadn't taken a look at your handbook and really had it reviewed for potentially troublesome policies in light of some of these recent rulings, definitely reach out to somebody who you can talk to and have a review of your handbook done to make sure that nothing is in there that could potentially trip you up under these new rulings and new rules. And then, as I said before, when we were talking about the trend of non-compete legislation across the country, the General Counsel of the National Labor Relations Board did send a memo out to the field offices to say that it's their view that non-competes are unlawful. That isn't necessarily official rulemaking, but it is something to note in terms of their appetite when it comes to non-compete agreements and enforcing them at least at this agency. All right, now over at the Department of Labor, they were busy as well. A lot of their items have not yet been finalized, but are getting very close to that. So really the biggest news over the Department of Labor was their proposed rule to change the Fair Labor Standards Act and the minimum salary threshold for someone to be non-exempt and overtime eligible. That if goes forward as proposed, that would bump up the minimum salary to, excuse me, $1,059 per week, or little over $55,000 a year. So again, what this means is that anyone earning less than that, regardless of their job duties, would be considered non-exempt and eligible for overtime whenever they work more than 40 hours in a week. So a big increase over where that number stands currently. They also proposed upping the highly compensated employee exemption, which basically means if someone earns a certain amount, then there isn't as much emphasis on their job duties. That number is just north of $100,000 now, but would be bumped up to about $144,000 if this process is as approved. So the comment period on this was 60 days. It started on September 8th, so it is now closed. We are awaiting the release and submission of the final rule on this. Should be coming in probably in the next several weeks, if not a couple of months, along with an effective date. It's very likely that this will be challenged legally. The last couple attempts by the Department of Labor to increase this number has been challenged in the courts. The first of which was during the Obama administration, where it was ultimately shot down. It was a little bit less than this amount. The Trump administration's Department of Labor did also initiate an increase, and that one was upheld. So there's no saying in terms of a lot of it will hinge on how this final rule is written and what court it ultimately goes to. But we'll keep our eyes on that. But there could potentially be a significant increase in the minimum salary amount for your exempt employees. So it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to start strategizing about that a little bit now, just in case. Any day now, we're expecting the final rule from the Department of Labor's new rule on who can be considered an independent contractor versus a W-2 employee. That has been submitted to the White House, the final rule. We just haven't quite got our eyes on it just yet. What this is going to bring is just a tighter definition on who can be considered an independent contractor. So again, under the previous administration, they changed the rules a little bit to kind of just have an overall look at control and allow for more opportunity, at least at the federal level. Many states are more strict, but allow for more independent contractors under federal rule. This is going to limit that again. It's really going to take a look at the economic reality. How economically dependent are the parties on one another? How integral is the work that this worker is performing to the main work of the business? If it's doing something that's along the lines of the mission or the purpose of the company that they're doing the work for, it's going to be more likely that that worker is an employee and not an independent contractor doing something unrelated. So having someone do some repairs or maintenance or janitorial services to your office is not integral to the work that you do in most cases, versus someone working behind a desk at a computer, speaking with clients and customers, is going to more likely be an employee there. And then there's what we're assuming stays the same from the proposed rule to the final version will just be a real deeper analysis of overall control, how the work is being done, when the work is being done, who owns the equipment that's being used, how much say does the company have over the worker, how truly independent is that worker when it comes to their work for this business. So more on that to come in the next couple of weeks, and we'll be sure to send something out once that's finalized. All right, so let's talk about a few of the most popular HR trends that we dealt with in 2023. So the first I would definitely say is flexible work arrangement. So 2023 brought us really the formal end of the need legally and due to COVID for work to be done on a remote basis. If a company wanted, they were within their rights and legal obligations to have people working in close proximity again. There weren't really any jurisdictions left that restricted that. But that being said, I think 2022 also saw a lot of that, and we also experienced what was known as the Great Resignation. So more and more people were leaving their positions, and a lot of them cited them being forced back into an office environment or back to on-site work, where in 2020 and 2021 they had the opportunity to work remotely and really liked it, and that loss of flexibility really led to a number of resignations for among other reasons too. Just some quick statistics. A study in Forbes showed that as of right now, about 13% of full-time U.S. workers are fully remote, meaning they don't, without any regular consistency, report to any office or work site. They're working remotely completely 100% of the time. Whereas 28.2% of U.S. workers right now are considered hybrid. So some mix, didn't really define it, whether it be 1 day a week, 1 week a month, 2 weeks a month, whatever it is, that there is some blend of hybrid and some on-site and some remote work. That leaves about 60% of the US workforce right now still working on-site at a workplace. So a separate study by Upwork is estimating that there is going to be a gradual yet significant increase over the next couple of years, and as many as 32.6 million Americans may be fully remote by 2025, by the end of 2025, which would represent about 22% of full-time US workers. So definitely studies, and this is not the only one that is foreseeing an increase in remote work over the next couple of years. In terms of businesses themselves, 16% of companies, I think according to a Mercer study, consider themselves to be fully remote without a formal office space or corporate location. 98% of employees in a recent study said they at least want some level of remote work, and that's what they expect or hope for. So those are kind of the numbers right now, and this has been a really crucial year for businesses to decide. We have seen several businesses work in terms of work towards coming back to the office or back to more on-site work, albeit with mixed results. There's a lot of considerations, a lot of important communication that has to go on. It's worked well for some and not for others. But I'd say more often than not, companies need to examine what works best for them. Be able to see how productivity has been affected, either negatively and in some instances positively, from hybrid or remote work arrangements, and adapt as such. One really important consideration, aside from logistics and business productivity, is the HR side of things and the compliance. So um, a lot of companies didn't realize as they were doing it, whether it was just allowing their current workforce to work from home or taking advantage of a much larger geographic footprint to hire remotely, that as they hired in states and cities outside of where their office had previously had housed all their employees, that all of a sudden they're finding themselves to be multi-state employers. And just because you don't have a physical office space there, if you're allowing work to be performed in those other locations by your employees, you do need to be mindful and compliant with the labor laws in those states. So if you haven't done so already, it's very, very, very important, because states have definitely ended their grace period and good faith acceptance of compliance when it comes to people having remote employees in their state. The coffers are drying up a little bit. Revenues are down at the state level. They're looking to get revenue, and sometimes these remote work situations and multi-state employers can be easy sources of income for these state agencies. So it's really important, if you haven't done so already, do a fairly in-depth HR audit of the states that you're in, and make sure that you're compliant with all the various laws in that state, whether it be minimum wage, PTO, sick time, PFML, wage and hour rules, training requirements, policy requirements, notice requirements. We do now have a really great electronic poster option where it can all be done via a link that you provide to the employee in the remote location, where they can then have access to all the required state labor posters, where you're not having to send them a physical poster, which wouldn't be practical, nor send them copies of PDFs. You can send them this link, and then based on their zip code, they'll have access to all the state notices that they need to. So feel free to hit us up if you're interested in that. Another real challenge when it comes to the flexible work arrangement is culture. So this was a tough learning lesson for a lot of businesses. How do we adapt where so much of our culture and our messaging and our brand and our employee experience was really based on in-person interactions and getting the teams together and having team building activities? And a lot of companies frankly struggled with translating that to a remote work environment. So definitely has been a focus point. A lot of our HR partners have been working with clients on, and successfully, I might add, in really adapting the key aspects of the culture and employee engagement to a virtual environment. So there are definitely methodologies to it, and theories and good practices to get into to be able to do so. And we're starting to see some success there, but this was really a transformative year in 2023 for companies learning how to get their culture to apply in a remote work environment. The next big trend is accommodations. And I think for both of these things, these are trends that are going to continue into 2024 without a doubt. But as I said, with that Supreme Court case, and I'd say even without it, just been a huge astronomical spike in religious accommodation cases. EEOC saw a 6x increase in the number of religious discrimination cases that they received in the last year. I think that was for 2022. I don't think they've released the 2023 data yet, but I bet it's going to be even more just from what we've seen in our reading and in working with businesses. That's been a really big focus point. More and more employees are seeking accommodations for their religious beliefs, and in a workplace now where customers are looking, they've adapted to a remote environment, so they're looking for more on-demand service, and businesses are running around the clock that used to honor more traditional work hours, so there's more ask on employees to be more available, and there's now been some pushback, especially when it comes to accommodations for religious reasons. So that's kind of the rub that we're experiencing at the moment. Also increases in terms of disability accommodations. So statistically, back issues continue to be number one. They have been for several years, but definitely seeing an increase, and this has been noted by the agencies as well, that anxiety and mental health are a rising concern and a rising condition in terms of requests for reasonable accommodation. Again, for both legitimate and in some cases just employees looking for ways to be able to continue to work from home when they are called back into the work site. Definitely seeing remote work as an accommodation request. Again, it's really important that you familiarize yourself with the interactive process and how that works, and um, what the expectations and requirements of you are as an employer in that. Whether or not remote work is considered a reasonable accommodation really varies case by case. Do make sure you are up to date on your job descriptions as well, that are an important tool for that determination, but definitely seeing remote work as a request in several accommodations within the interactive process. Also, paid family medical leave. Again, these vary state by state, but several have pretty strict retaliation clauses. So in terms of easing employees back into their roles, making sure that they're not adversely impacted when they do return from these paid family medical leaves, has been a big trend. Again, just a lot more activity and engagement with these paid family leave programs, meaning more employees going out on leaves and subsequently returning. So more potential cases for conflict there, or claims of discrimination or retaliation. Um, Unfortunately, a lot of times these won't be your star employees that are going out on this leave, and it really behooves you as a business to make sure you're staying on top of your documentation, on your disciplinary actions, so that, way too often, and it stinks, it happens to the best of us, but there'll be those employees where you say, I've been meaning to write them up. We haven't been happy with their performance, but we haven't actually documented it or necessarily spoken to them about it, but we were thinking about letting them go. And then all of a sudden they find themselves on a job protected leave, and then don't want to say you're stuck with them, but your options are very limited, both for the time while they're on that job protected leave, and then again, in many cases, even after they return, you got to be very mindful that you're not doing something that could be viewed as retaliatory. And then the third really big trend that we saw in 2023 was really centered around engagement and retention. So as we stated a few minutes ago, the Great Resignation really hit folks hard in 2022. So there was a lot of focus on making sure that we're getting an idea for what the employees are looking for, what they value, um, having those conversations, doing some surveys, getting in front of the people, even if they are remote. I think many companies lost a finger on the pulse of their employees just in that remote environment. They were used to being able to walk around the office and overhear things, and have those conversations where you got to be a lot more intentional with it in this kind of new age of work. And so I think companies did a pretty good job at getting more on top of that this year. Definitely cited in some of the numbers, the turnover rate average at businesses was down from 24.7% down to 17.3%. So a pretty significant decrease there. In terms of what businesses are planning to do, or we're planning to do in 2023, 13% of businesses are planning to expand headcount. There are 10% that were planning to reduce headcount. Whereas 2022 was the Great Resignation, 2023 brought the term quiet quitting, which I know a lot of people aren't fans of, but for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it was essentially kind of employees just kind of working the bare minimums in terms of their job duties when it came to their job description and their responsibilities, not doing extra work, not going above and beyond, not volunteering for things, but just kind of scraping by. What that's kind of led to is a term I just read about a couple of weeks ago called quiet cutting. So this is more on the business side where kind of in exchange for the quiet quitting, you're seeing businesses not necessarily doing a reduction in force or doing layoffs, but instead just kind of standing pat, waiting for people to retire, sometimes adding undesirable responsibilities to other workers, kind of driving them out a little bit indirectly, not backfilling those positions. So kind of avoiding the experience of a layoff or a reduction or more announced cuts, more for this kind of more sly and less announced tactic, which as an HR professional, I tend to caution against. Um, People see the writing on the walls more often than not, but again, something you want to consult with an HR pro, especially when it comes to the PR side of things when considering something like that. There is definitely an uncertain economy right now in several sectors, and I think you're seeing that reflected on both sides of the coin. So I think that in addition to employers having a better read on their employees and making more of an attempt at engagement and retention, employees are being a little bit more cautious about starting a new opportunity. They're seeing, especially in some industries, a lot of cuts and a lot of layoffs, and there's always the fear of being the first one in or the last one in and the first one out. So I think that's leading to a little bit of the reduction in employee turnover on the voluntary side. I also think you're seeing businesses be a little bit more cautious with things as well. Um, Different challenges in the recruiting world, but still challenges nonetheless. And then I think we're also seeing culture really addressed, more plainly and at the forefront. I think prior to 2023, you were seeing a lot of people just kind of behind the scenes say what their culture was and not really making it part of anything published or anything announced. Whereas people really grasped the bull by the horns in 2023 and said, we're going to be culture driven. This is what our culture is. We wanted to make sure everybody's on the same page and buys into the culture and adheres to and adopts and embraces our culture as a business. And I saw a lot more of that in this year. And that was definitely an encouraging sign from a strategic HR perspective. Some other trends, definitely more on the mental health awareness side, which is a great thing. There are all kinds of new programs out there. EAPs are doing more and more around mental health. There's also a program known as mental health first aid, which is a great thing, really empowering businesses and leaders to help alleviate mental concerns and identify mental health concerns in the workplace. Yeah, I think we saw 2023 bring in, just show that diversity and inclusion and similar programs were not just a fad. Seeing it expand to other industries that hadn't typically embraced those initiatives and doing more and more with it. We also saw a lot of companies either because they were forced to by some of the laws we talked about at the start of the presentation today, embracing pay transparency. And even for folks who haven't been required to do it, really learning about how to leverage it and how to make it work for you and use it as a tool in your recruiting and retention process. Also saw a lot of businesses really take the time to map out their career growth for different positions within the organization, which again, I think helped secure some of those better retention rates in 2023. Just a lot more in terms of process and plan design and communication to employees so that they had a better idea for whether they're in person or remote, how they can move up within an organization. And then again, just really a focus on the quote unquote employee experience, whether you're in person, whether you work in a hub where there are other people nearby, or whether you're way off where you don't have a fellow employee for hundreds of miles, making sure that there's a cohesive, consistent, and valuable employee experience across the board. All right, so let's look ahead. What are we predicting are going to be the main HR topic trends in 2024? So the first of which I got to say is AI. You're seeing it everywhere. Everybody's talking about it. Everyone's dipping their toes in it a little bit. It's definitely what I would say is probably the hottest topic in HR right now as we head into 2024. I think for this one especially, and for all the potential HR trending topics, we will be having much more focused presentations on this, both via webinars like this, as well as some on-site presentations at some conferences and events that'll be interactive, and we're really looking forward to talking about this topic especially. But definitely some considerations when it comes to AI in along with HR. So the first of which is compliance. So never the fun aspect of HR, but perhaps the most important. A lot of focus from both federal and state agencies with concerns that AI might lead to bias and discrimination. So there's going to be a watchful eye on that as AI becomes more and more ingrained at businesses. Are the AI tools being biased or discriminatory in any way? We did also recently talk about in a past presentation, the White House issued an executive order specific to AI with some pretty clear direction to all of the federal agencies, as well as requiring them to have a chief AI officer at each agency. So more on that to come for sure. And then when it comes to the practicality and the application of AI within a workforce, several considerations there. Definitely some convenience, but what are the potential costs to utilizing AI, both financially in terms of utilizing different software suites and things like that, as well as other potential downsides to AI. Is it going to change the voice of the company? Will it have a negative impact on culture? Will it have a negative impact on retention or that quote unquote employee experience we just talked about? Also, what are the limitations with AI in terms of context? So often when we talk about AI, when we talk about HR and best practices, it's not something that's black and white. We always caution against using Google as your HR tool or even a call center, because those places aren't going to know how you've historically handled things or what the culture is at your business, or sometimes what very recent rulings by the agencies we talked about or court litigation, how it's changed what the best practice is for an HR scenario. So AI, can sometimes inherently lack context, lack really up-to-date data when it comes to some of these important rulings. So there is some caution there as well. And that goes for the reliability. So, ChatGPT will be the first to admit that, there is an end date in terms of compliance reasons, how up to date their database is with laws and rules and things like that. So you got to be very cautious there in terms of the reliability when it comes to compliance data within some of these AI tools. And then, HR and businesses are going to be faced with some potentially difficult decisions, especially as AI advances and has more capabilities. Is this going to be used as an enhancement to your staff or as a replacement to your staff in certain areas? So definitely some tough considerations and potentially tough decisions to be made in the year to come there. Next is, we really foresee a focus on managers in 2024. Now we've kind of solidified our workforce a little bit. How do we make sure that we up things to the next level? So definitely an investment in managers when it comes to training and developing those folks. Um, Managers can either be a huge liability for your organization or they can be a huge strength. So from a legal perspective, managers are agents of your company. So if they're not handling harassment claims correctly, or God forbid committing harassment themselves, those are things that those are crimes that your organization is committing. So we're seeing more and more businesses realize this and invest in their managers and management training to not only reduce and eliminate those liabilities and exposures, but really then turn those managers into company champions and compliance champions, and really help move the company forward on its goals and aspirations. Also, a big focus, as we said, it's more difficult than ever for especially executive leaders to get a finger on the pulse of their business and the workforce. They can no longer do those walks around the cubicles and overhear things and talk to people. these folks are remote. So a lot of this is really now put on managers to be effective remote leaders, doing the proper check-ins, getting the information, um, being really sincere and direct with folks and doing that outreach and answering some of the questions that aren't being asked. It's really important that your managers don't rest on their laurels and really develop some skills for managing remote workforce, if that's something that your company is engaging in terms of remote work. And then again, businesses are changing, whether it's AI, whether it's layoffs, whether it's mergers and acquisitions. Um, many, if not most businesses are undergoing some sort of change and certainly will in 2024. So empowering and finding the right managers and supervisors that are going to be not only comfortable with change management, but really be leaders and be tools for you when it comes to managing change, is more crucial than ever. So never a bad time to do some personality assessments. Make sure that the folks that you have in leadership and managerial positions are going to help you to be change agents and not get in the way of these changes occurring at your business. And then data. So, data has increasingly found its way into the HR space. Certainly, there have historically always been certain aspects of a business that have been data driven. You think about sales and pipeline reports and sales reports and leading indicators and lagging indicators. Those have always been there. And then there have always been those departments within an organization that have shied away from the data. It's more about the soft skills and customer service that you can't really measure with numbers. But more and more, and I think we'll see this really explode in 2024 as more tools become available. You're finding those business areas that have shied away from data starting to dip their toes in it, and then over time really start to champion it in many cases. So just finding ways that you can measure things that you didn't think about before, and finding what those measures are and how you're going to track them, and really letting data tell the story for your business, or for certain functions, or for certain goals or forecasts that you have in the year to come. And again, just adoption of data across a company. Sometimes that can be individual scorecards, and really, again, when it comes to performance review time, you have some positions that are very easy to rate a performance based on how much revenue they brought in, or how they met certain well-defined metrics. But again, you're seeing much more accountability, which makes the review process infinitely easier when you can have some actual numeric measures of each and every member of your staff to help rate your performance. Now, it's very important you take the time to consider what those measures are, and do they really speak and tell the story you're hoping it to, and really speak to good or poor performance. But over time, more and more businesses are seeing the value in analyzing data. And then finally, I think a big HR trend for 2024 is going to be bracing for all these changes coming, especially from the federal agencies. So with such an uncertain presidential election coming towards the end of 2024, um, we think that a lot of the federal agencies are going to take advantage of the time that they know that they have. Again, we've got that overtime rule coming. We've got independent contractor rules coming. There'll certainly be legal challenges as well to all of those things, excuse me, but we expect to see even more activity within the federal agencies, Department of Labor, OSHA, National Labor Relations Board, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. All of those folks are going to be doing a lot in 2024. So it's really important that you get ahead of those things. Definitely stay on our mailing list, attend our webinars, work closely with us. Our goal is for us to be the first people you hear about these things from. So a lot of times we're working with businesses and helping them strategize, and really helping them plan for the just in case, just so that when these things do happen, they're not scrambling to meet the effective dates. So um, get ready for all of that. So that brings us to the end of our presentation today. I hope that this was a valuable retrospective for you for 2023, and you're feeling like you got a finger on the pulse of what we're expecting to see in the next year. Should you have any questions, or want to discuss any of these things with myself or a member of our HR team, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to talk. And otherwise, I'll hand things back over to Brianna.
Thank you, Paul. To learn more about MP's full service solutions for 2023 and more, I just dropped a link in the chat that will connect you with an MP team member. You can also visit our website at mp-hr.com for more information. Be sure to join us for our upcoming webinar, HR and AI, Harnessing the Power of AI. Visit our website to register and to see the full calendar of upcoming events and available resources. We will be sending out a recording of today's webinar with the presentation slides this afternoon. Thanks for joining us and have a terrific day.